It is my pleasure today to introduce a panel that is going to provide an update about what the Aquatic Insects Working Group has been doing since their inception. And so it's going to be led by our own Jessica Ware from the American Museum of Natural History. Our panelists include Anna Eichert, also of the American Museum of Natural History, Abigail Kirkcaldy of Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, and Geert de Kniff of the Research Institute for Forest and Nature in Belgium. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Christy. So we have a pretty active group of folks that are interested in looking at trends in aquatic insects. And our goal today as a working group was to invite people to this panel who could talk to us about what they are finding is happening in their groups, their organismal groups, or the trends that they've seen in their sites, kind of writ large. We're going to ask a few questions about these observations and the types of data that we wish we had, that hopefully all of us as a community could start to collect so that we could get some answers. And then there'll be some time at the end, hopefully, for questions from the audience. So I'll start just by saying that I'll be posing the questions. My name is Jessica Ware. I'm a curator here at the American Museum of Natural History, as Christy mentioned, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists if you could just briefly mention, who you are, what organismal group you work on, if you have a particular focus of aquatic insects, where and maybe the region of the world you work in. I'll just chime in and say I work on dragonflies. And I'll start with Anna, and then we'll go to Abby, and then we'll go to Geert.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Anna Eichert, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a PhD student, like Christy mentioned, at the American Museum of Natural History with Jessica as my advisor. And I'm actually also the co-chair of the Aquatic Insect Decline Working Group for this wonderful RCN. So I'm honored to be here. And I previously studied the ecological impact of wildfires and flash floods on aquatic insect communities in Utah. But now I'm diving into the biodiversity and systematics of stoneflies, or the order Plecoptera, for my dissertation. I absolutely love fieldwork, and I love connecting with ecosystems I've had the pleasure of working in. I've done a bit of species distribution modeling, conservation genomics, population genetics, and I'm an advocate for aquatic insect conservation and love to talk about it. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Anna. Abby?
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here. This is my first time kind of joining this group, and it's really nice getting to come and talk to all of you. My name's Abigail Kirkcaldy. I go by she, her for pronouns, and I am a PhD student at Rhodes University in South Africa. I kind of work on everything slightly weird and wonderful insects. So I do a little bit on like bristletails and Mycoptera, but with the aquatic insects, my main focus is stoneflies, and that's the subject of my dissertation, the PhD that I'm working on. Specifically, I tend to work on taxonomy and evolutionary history mainly. So I'm looking at the biogeography and taxonomy of Neoperla, which is a genus of stonefly that has just been broken up from a species complex that like covered the entire continent into 82 species. And I'm trying to figure out what its actual like diversity and distribution is kind of across the continent. I mainly work in South Africa, but I've been really lucky to have an opportunity to do some stuff in Rwanda and work on material from Angola as well. So kind of everywhere subtropical Africa is my field of interest.
Thanks, Abby. Geert?
Hello, everyone. I'm Geert Knijf. I'm working as a researcher, as ecologist in the freshwater team within the Research Institute for Nature and Forest in Brussels, Belgium. It's a Flemish governmental institute. As an ecologist within the freshwater team, I have particular interest in dragonflies, especially on conservation, distribution, ecology, management, monitoring, and so on. And from within that case, I'm also not only interested in dragonflies within Belgium, because it's so small, but let's say rather the whole Western Palearctic, especially Northern Africa, Western Asia, and also the whole of Europe. And within that case, I coordinated the Red List of Dragonflies of Europe that was published last year ago. And I'm also active in the Dragonfly Specialist Group of IUCN, and within also the new consortium, the Foundation of Dragonfly Conservation Europe, where we want to have more attention to dragonflies, especially depending on the indicators, conservation, try to build a common database, and so on.
Thanks, Geert, and thanks, Abby. Thanks, Anna, for being here. So here, maybe we'll start with you for this first question, or maybe the second question, if you count the intro as the first question. So especially with your perspective leading an IUCN group, you've kind of looked more broadly across the order Odonata across Europe. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing in terms of abundance and species richness for Odonata over time. I've seen you present on this before, but if you could share some of the kind of highlights of what you're discovering in terms of Odonata trends, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, what we mostly for red listing people it's quite difficult to calculate trends, especially if you want to do it on the last 10 years from year to year calculation trends. It's not that easy, and luckily we are in Europe and we have a lot of data. Maybe probably a third question, but for the red list, especially for the western part of Europe, I think we more or less collected about 30-40 million records from the last 10-15 years of dragonflies. So this enabled us to calculate some trends, because if we're only looking at first, in general aspect, many species of dragonflies doing it much better. Let's say more or less nearly half of them are doing it much better, partly due to climate change. It's warmer, especially in northern parts of Europe, warmer springs, warmer summers. And so in the first stage, it seems to be a positive evolution. But it's also backslash on it. If you have to look to more, not a common species, but with species which are specific habitat requirements, like species of the Mediterranean, streams and rivers, there we found a steep decline, because many of those species have rather restricted range or endemic to an island. So you only have quite often 20, 30, 50 populations over the time. And so if something is going wrong, if the streams fall dry out, partly due to climate, but mostly of water abstraction for farming, intensification of agriculture, greenhouses, especially for tomatoes and paprikas and others, they use a lot of water. And the problem is that most often they directly tap off the water, not from the stream, but the farmers, they go to the source when the water come out from the mountains, and there they take off all the water. So we don't even have not even 1 meter of water. So it's easily, the species are gone. That's quite easy, but that's already a longer phenomenon already. We are already going on from the 80s, already 30, 40 years. But still continuing, it's still becoming worse over time. The second part, which is doing absolutely not well, is the group that are specifically typical for nutrient poor smaller ponds. Let's say oligotrophic if you want, but without having this question, what is oligotrophic, but there are other nutrient pools which have a more in the southern Europe have distribution higher in the mountains. But ones in the central part of Europe and northern, you have in the lowlands. It should be, those species were in the past quite common, quite often in huge numbers. And there we found for a lot of them, of those species, declines of at least 50%. Let's say it depends a little bit. Let's say if you have species which are more in a decline in France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and UK, we had about around 70, 80%, even 90% of decline over a period of 10 years. So that's dramatically. For some species, we found for 3 or 4 countries, even 98 and 99%. So those species are really, and within 5 or 7 years, they're completely collapsing. Those species are also present further north up till up to the polar circle in Scandinavia. And even there in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Finland, we could detect a decline of around 45, 50, 55%. So it's something, a phenomenon that not only happened in the more populated, urbanized parts of Europe, but also further up north. Quite often the reasons for this, of the negative this decline, it's a combination of factors. Climate is one, but also the eutrophication, nitrogen deposition, so intensive farming, pigs, cows, cattle, whatever you want. Many of those bogs system, they are allowed about 10, 20 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare per year. That's about the threshold limit, what's calculated. If you want to keep that ecosystem in a good condition, that's above the limit. In many of our regions, we have about, it's falling out from the air. We have a deposition of 100, 150, even on some parts in some parts of Denmark and northern Germany, nearly 200 kilo of nitrogen deposition a year. So it is about 10 times the critical limit. And that's fine for 1 year or 2 years and 3 years. But if you do that for 20, 30 years, and then you have some warm summers with low precipitation, and then the water, the whole nitrogens and phosphates come much more concentrated. So the whole system starts collapsing, starts changing, and you get also interactions with more southern species that come to live there, which are species typical for eutrophic ponds, and they have intra-guild predation and competition. The larvae of those new arrivals are stronger, bigger, so they predate on the other ones, typical of those moorland, of those speed bogs, but also the adults. So you have not only the system is changing, so even if, let's say, if you put some of the eutrophication away and the temperatures should start cooling down, you have a lot of water, but you have other species who colonize those nutrient poor ponds. So the whole system is completely collapsing. So it's a cascade of reasons, and they also interact with each other. So that's more or less the two main problems we have in Europe. So first, you had in the southern streams, you had typically, if there is those species which are declining there, they're typical for the small streams and smaller rivers. So if they have no water, the species are gone. Or if river fall completely dry, you have a larval cycle of 3-4 years. Well, if you have 4 or 5 months of dry out, that's a serious problem. In the north, even if there's water, it's a lot of other combinations that we have there. I would keep it
That's
like this
bleak.
more in general for the picture in Europe. And that's more or less also the same picture. If we did some analysis, not published, also for Northern Africa, for Morocco, there is also climate, but also Morocco, the intensification of agriculture. I think the export to Europe has 100-fold becoming within the last 20 years. So everywhere you see greenhouses for tomatoes and paprikas and peppers and whatever vegetables you want for export to Europe. So they also need to have water. So it's also a problem there or in Turkey. So it's not only Europe, but the whole, let's say, at least in the Western part, we see it quite clearly. That's a really big impact.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite a bleak, bit of information and outlook. Thank you so much for sharing that, Geert. And I know that, the amount of data analysis that goes into analyzing 30 to 40 million records is not insignificant. So thanks to you and the Red List for compiling all of this information. And I'm processing it as I'm thinking about what's happening in the country that I live in. I'm from Canada, but I live in the United States, where they're actually rolling back freshwater regulations. And I would be curious to know, when people do this across the United States, what they would find. Let's maybe move to you, Abby.
Go ahead. Can I still give a comment? Just to give you an idea of considering what should happen in could happen, also happen in North America. When we did the first red list in 2010, 15 years ago, some of those species with the whole group of experts in Europe, some of them say they are declining, but we didn't have the data. And others said, oh no, those species are everywhere, they're still doing it quite well. And probably because now with the new red list, I'm living in one of the most populated regions or countries in Europe with a high intensive farming and industry. So we saw it rather in those regions already started 20 years ago. We saw it going on. And now, within only a period of 10, 15 years, others, also experts from Scandinavia, from Sweden, from Poland, from Czech Republic, they say, yeah, now we also start seeing those things are changing. So, and that's now we could prove it with data. We have a lot of data, but without that, we have no proof at all how others, well, it's a feeling. And to give you an idea, those species are still widespread. Those are in former past. If you take a map of Europe, the species are everywhere. They're 2/3 of Europe completely. So they were not rare species. They were rather common species, but they're completely disappearing. And
Yeah.
yeah.
That's really scary. I mean, Eliza and colleagues, Graham's, have shown something similar, even for really common butterflies, just in the last 20 years. So since you mentioned Northern Africa here, let's move to you, Abby. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in South Africa and the regions that you're working in? I assume you're working in both lentic and low-tick habitats, as Geert was.
I'm mainly focusing on fast-flowing rivers and streams just because I'm mainly working on the stonefly. So I haven't kind of covered as much. I'm generally focusing on kind of mountain streams and that myself at the moment. But to be honest, we kind of have the opposite problem. Where in Europe, you've got 40 million records to work with. We're playing catch up a little bit. And I know I'm biased. I'm a taxonomist, so of course I'm going to say this. But one of the problems is we still don't really know what we have biodiversity-wise. So, every time we go and sample, we're coming back, it's like, well, we're actually finding all of these new species, but the trends that have been going on in the past and kind of what's actually happening to the biodiversity is largely hidden. To use stoneflies as an example, I mean, I mentioned the 82 species that recently happened. That was 2 years ago. So we have 120 stonefly species south of the Sahara Desert. 82 of them were described in 2023. Even before that, the other 20, which are mainly notonomorids, which are these like high mountain endemics, those were only described in the late 90s. So about 100 of our species were described in the last 30 years. So in terms of what's happened to them, what's changed over time, we really don't know. Kind of anything before that is very, very general. So to be honest, a lot of what's kind of happening now is tackling museum collections to try and kind of see trends from that. And it's not a perfect example, but we can hopefully like pick up some ideas of what species are we not seeing as often, what species are we finding rarely, but that were kind of collected abundantly in the past. I will also say one of the problems we're also running into is a lot of our descriptions have been based on museum species. So there's not as much kind of active collecting as being a little bit slow to kind of gather and get that just because it's such a large area to gather. So we have got multiple species that the last specimen that was collected would have been in the 1950s, particularly amongst the Neoperla group, the ones that were described in 2023. Some of those have not been collected in the last 50, 70 years. And similarly, even with the ones that are being more actively collected, we're not getting a lot of data on, there's not a lot of data available on where they're being found. So a lot of our kind of distribution data is out of date. So I am going to say, take everything that I'm about to say with a pinch of salt, because it's largely based on feeling. But the general trend that I'm noticing from my sampling is pretty much the same as what you described in Europe with the Odonata. We've got a couple of really widespread dominant species. So amongst the Neoperla, there's things like Transvalensis and Pan-Africana, which are found everywhere from South Africa up to Guinea, kind of just south of the Sahara, and even into Egypt a little bit. And those species seem to be doing great. They are still abundant. We're still finding a lot of them. But the kind of localized endemics, we seem to be finding a lot more of. So for me, I found that amongst the notonomorids, which are these high mountain endemics that need very clean, fast-flowing water, they're very, very vulnerable to pollution. We're finding a lot of sites that used to be abundant and have multiple species, might still have 1 or 2 species, but are dropping down in numbers. They're a lot harder to find. And a lot of sites are now just empty and devoid of stoneflies. So the general trend definitely seems to be that we are losing species. But yes, at the moment, we're kind of still figuring out what's there. So that's where my work at the moment is largely just trying to figure out baseline distribution data and ecological data of what we've got and where it is.
Thanks, Abby. So Anna, you are also kind of working, you kind of work a lot in rivers, and you do a lot of work in the Arctic. Do you want to maybe give some of your perspective from the places that you are collecting and the organisms that you're focusing on?
Yeah. So first I just want to reiterate, I think most of us know this in this Zoom call, but like freshwater diversity is like so beautiful. Like inland freshwater covers less than 1% of Earth's surface, yet harbors 10% of all known animal species. And of this diversity, there's like 60 to 70% of it is estimated to be aquatic insects alone. So which today number around 100,000 described species, which is likely an underestimate. And all aquatics are so necessary in facilitating nutrient and energy flow in freshwater systems. And of this, some studies have reported like at least 25% of freshwater invertebrate species are under the threat of extinction. So I think, so we've been reviewing papers in our working group for to just like generally tackle like seeing how aquatic insects may be declining from various portions of the world. And in general, scientists are often looking at particular drivers of decline within their study region. Like for instance, if your area of study is undergoing like deforestation or channelization of water diversion, et cetera, you would be more honed in on these direct and indirect effects that you're seeing as changes in the landscape are currently happening. And these studies are incredibly valuable, but I think it's also extremely important to establish long-term studies on aquatic insect community assemblages to provide baseline data that we can then compare in future years, like what Yurt and Abby have mentioned. So for instance, going back to the Arctic, I worked at Toolik Field Station in Arctic Alaska for various projects, which the Arctic is disproportionately one of the fastest warming biomes on Earth. There's a long-term ecological research group there and scientists from the National Ecological Observatory Network that have historically collected aquatic insect diversity hand in hand with stream metric data. That's pretty standard in like bioassessment studies. So this can be like conductivity, turbidity, pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen, etc. And they've been collecting these data for decades. And this is a great example of like some projects that will serve as like good baseline data in addition to Yurt and hopefully future projects in Africa and other less surveyed areas of the world that can be used to see how like future community assemblages have changed. And it's hard to identify like what drivers in particular are causing aquatics to decline just because they are so biodiverse. Anecdotally, I have a few examples from the United States of recent like studies that have come out. One genus that is of particular interest is the burrowing mayfly hexagenia in the upper Mississippi and Lake Erie, which at one time was like a huge success story because after decades of essentially no mayfly hatches, they returned to the lake as water quality improved thanks to the Clean Water Act, which was enacted in 1948, but then was significantly reorganized and expanded in 1972. But unfortunately in like 2020, there were reports of like pollution and algal blooms that reduced the dissolved oxygen of the water body and led to chronic hypoxia that reduced the hatches to fractions of what they had previously been. So constant monitoring and environmental protections on freshwater habitats is essential. But yeah, so in general, I feel like we're also just seeing declines in the Arctic, but also in the United States. In Illinois, the Illinois Natural History Survey, they've been collecting aquatic insects, especially stoneflies, all over that state for more than 100 years. And a study that came out in 2005, based on 5,000 specimen records. So reiterating that museum collections are incredibly important for this work as well. They found that there were 2 extinctions of endemics in Illinois and 20 extirpations of 77 stonefly species, which this rate of loss is greater than mussels or fish in Illinois. And another like 19 species were designated as critically imperiled because they were only found at like 5 or less locations. So species at risk were the ones that were seen to have longer life cycles and direct egg hatches rather than like going through a egg diapause stage. So those are just like some like brief examples of like recent studies that have come out. But there are so many different things hitting aquatic insects, whether that be like habitat destruction, like pesticides, like there's so many things going on and it's really terrifying. So I'm glad that we're able to come together at this point and actually talk about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. I will say I'll just say on we weren't able to be joined by Sid Cannings, but Sid Cannings and his brothers they have done a lot of work in the Canadian Arctic, and they mostly have worked on dragonflies and damselflies, although they work on other insects as well. And they're seeing similar trends in the Canadian Arctic to what Geert was mentioning, where some things are doing quite well. Some things are expanding their range. There are things that are found north of the tree line that used to not be found north of the tree line at 66 degrees latitude. And then there are things that are doing quite poorly. So it seems like as we go continent to continent, hemisphere to hemisphere, there are going to be winners and there's going to be losers. I always find it interesting that, I mean, here mentioned having 30 to 40 million records to go through, which is a lot. But actually, given how beautiful and charismatic dragonflies are and how many people live in Europe, I almost wonder why every single person doesn't have a diary of dragonflies and damselflies. Same to the problem that Abby mentioned, that Anna mentioned, kind of wanting to try and we're looking, you know, in museum collections and trying to get baseline data to understand what we have. I always find that surprising when there is actually like large groups of humans that do fishing. And that really are aware of hatches and that really are aware of the taxa that are living in fresh water. And so the people who might have access to data about decline or about trends or about increases might not necessarily be, you know, graduate students, academics, postdocs. It might be a variety of people who are using the water in various ways. We all need water and we all interact with it in different ways. So I guess my question to the group, and I'll start with you here, please, is knowing what you know about the trends in your group, what are some types of data that you wish people were collecting? The average Nana that's walking with her dog every time she goes to a stream, like what would be useful data? The angler, the fisherman who's doing fishing in the stream, like what type of data would be useful to really understand what's happening with odonates, for example, or freshwater insects in Europe?
Okay. To give an idea, in Europe we have about 145 species of dragonflies, so that's limited. Most of them already described in the 19th century, more or even before. So we know quite well taxonomy is stable. We have many field guides and a lot of languages. We have apps for species identification. What we find in some regions, we have a lot of data and others not. Let's say, to give you an idea, I think in Belgium we have more or less 1 million of records. Greece, which is 4 or 5 times the size of Belgium, it has not even 10,000 records. And it depends a little bit how you look, how to collect data. And more and more, especially the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, people are using opportunistic data from citizen science. So what we don't ask, if you only should rely on data from academic or university or researchers, you only have a very small amount of data. We ask everyone, if you go out, you see a dragonfly with your smartphone, take a picture, you have a website, put on it. There are some automatic verifications tools. There are validators who check the pictures for each country. So at least there is a control. And if you start doing it and ask people to get more and more data, you easily can have a lot of data. On some days, and I think Belgium, it's more or less the size of New York City or something like that, or maybe a little bit more. Flanders is 13,000 square kilometers, so it's a rather big city. And in summer we have on average a day 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 records a day. Just to give you an idea, because everyone, grandmother, young woman with her daughter, with babies, she's walking, they're sitting, they see something nice, they take pictures, a plant, a butterfly, a bird, everything is fine. You can put it on the website, and so at least not everything is correct, and probably only can use 90% of the data. So it takes some work to clean up the data. And other countries, they don't trust it. Well, you need to collect it. We want to have every specimen in the hand or put it in a museum. And in some countries, even with the bigger size, they arrive after 30 or 40 years, they have 4,000 or 5,000 records. But with 4,000 or 5,000 records, calculating a trend, I don't see how we can do it. So for some countries we didn't have, but at least we have a good range, let's say from the Mediterranean up to the Arctic, from east to west, not for every country, but for several countries. So at least it's it helps those kind of citizen science projects, those, and also those species identification. So therefore, I would go try to start with giving courses for the wider public, but most countries where also a dragonfly society, they organize excursions. You start to learn how to identify the species. Start with the easiest one, with the commons one. Start with the adults, not with the exuvia or with the nymphs. And finally, after people getting some, are a little bit getting used with the adults, they go further. Oh, you have also a nymphs or larva stage and exuvia. Can we? Some of them are quite easy to identify, others not. So you get more and more data, and if you start working on putting your energy and your effort in it, after 10, 15 years, this can give a really good, a lot of data.
Thanks, Geert. That's a great perspective. And there's some comments in the chat. Thanks, everyone, for commenting about different citizen science and community science projects that are underway and databases that people can contribute to. How about for Abby? Can we go to you next? What are some things that you wish, I mean, probably you would say you wish we had more taxonomists in South Africa working on the stoneflies, but in seriousness, what are some things, types of data that you think would be helpful to understand the trends that you're seeing?
So honestly, a lot of the stuff that we've just been talking about, the citizen science stuff, one of the big things we're struggling with is a lot of our species have very limited records. You know, you collect a couple of specimens, you do your description, and this is one of the flaws of taxonomy. You kind of leave it. It's done now. On to the next thing. So one of the problems we've got for a lot of our species is even if we know it's there, simple things like when are its emergence times, what is its full distribution, what is it doing throughout the year, besides the kind of general trends that you're going to see year to year with global climate change and all of that, we have a lot of our gaps in just what are they actually doing. So what I would love to see more of, and I think citizen science programs like iNaturalist and all of that, I saw Craig and Dan calling out Dan as well. Those are really fantastic systems to get this, because really what we need to start getting is an idea of just where these things are and what they're doing. And that's beyond just the stoneflies. I'd say one of the problems we've kind of got across definitely sub-Saharan Africa is there's just so many gaps in our knowledge and data where even if we know what species are there, we just don't know what they're doing. So trying to kind of build up that network and start getting more and more of that idea of the species so that we can then figure out what we need to test. If we know it's declining, we can start figuring out, okay, well, this is when it's around, what might be influencing its diversity. Because at the moment, one of the pieces of data I'm really keen to start getting and want to start testing is like, what are the drivers of this diversity loss? But we genuinely don't have a starting point. So like that's really what I would love to see more of. And then furthermore, research on the drivers, like what's actually happening in this.
Just as a follow-up question, Abby, I know for like a lot of thinking about the odonates, the dragonflies and damselflies that we study in my lab, for a majority of the species, we actually don't even know generation time. For some things, we know generation time, maybe 6 weeks, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, but for a lot of them, we really don't. And that is challenging to really know. I mean, Geert, you briefly mentioned generation time and longevity of, lifespan of a species. For ones where you don't know, that makes it much harder to do a management plan to understand population trends, whether the nymph is going to be 5 years or it's going to be 6 weeks. That makes a big difference. Do we have any of those types of data for the stoneflies in South Africa?
For the stoneflies, no, definitely not for the stoneflies. For other groups, there is some of that data. So dragonflies, for example, we've had a history of really good research that is building some of that. So it's not kind of universal across the aquatic insects, but for some groups, we've got these huge gaps. And stoneflies is definitely one where we're pretty sure most of them are probably univoltine. So just one. Some of them seem to synchronize up their emergence, others don't. So for example, Neoperla, they're a little bit more tropical. They seem to just have an emergence and egg laying kind of throughout summer, spring. But a lot of this is kind of general trends. It's one of the things I'm trying to tackle for my PhD is trying to figure some of that out, but it's working off kind of historical data. It isn't being tested. So yes, that is definitely something we need more of.
Thank you. How about you, Anna? In the places where you're doing your collecting, I know that as part of the working group, we're actually going to try and get data from anglers through a collaboration with the Salmonfly Project. Could you maybe talk about ways, different types of data that you're hoping that we can gather?
Yeah, I'll start with just mentioning the survey that Jessica just talked about. So it's really exciting, but in collaboration with our nonprofit, the Salmonfly Project, which they're based out of Montana, a wonderful organization that works a lot with the public and anglers. We're creating a survey to get an idea about generalized trends on aquatic insect decline in North America and are hoping to expand it globally if we can. And so anglers, like, they have a really pretty good experience and knowledge of insect hatches and how they've changed over time. And so the anglers that take this survey, they must have been fishing in the same watershed or water body for 10 plus years. And there are questions in the survey that kind of gauge their knowledge of aquatic insect identification. So if it's like little to no knowledge to intermediate, where they can identify specific hatches, or to advanced, where they can identify specific nymphs and adults of certain species in their region. And so we simply just want to ask, according to their observations and experience, have insect hatches broadly changed since they began fishing in that region, and what environmental factor they may attribute their observations of changing populations to, whether this be like temperature, sedimentation, urbanization, the introduction of invasive species, and more. Um, the number of people estimated to participate in freshwater fishing in the U.S. is 25.4 million people alone. But again, we hope to expand the survey on a global scale. So if anyone in this Zoom call has fly fishing friends, they have fly fishing organizations that they know about, everyone's anonymous who takes the survey. Please let us know. And yeah, but I also agree with what Yurt and Abby were saying, like citizen science is so important, especially like in this day and age, and getting the word out that aquatic insects are awesome and that they exist to the public is also just like incredibly important. So like using iNaturalist or other regional biodiversity websites, like some of the things that people have put in the chat, to take like good quality images of caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, etc. Will be important to know, like even if like emergent states shift with time, for scientists, for instance. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks to those who have put some resources in the chat. I think that, as all of you have kind of mentioned, we do tend to have a bit of a terrestrial bias. And so just kind of getting people understanding about aquatic insects is going to be key. I noticed none of you mentioned genetic or genomic data, and I would just chime in that I wish specimens were collected sometimes in ethanol, because I think understanding genetic diversity across populations might be key, especially in some of the scenarios that Geert was mentioning, you know, where you end up having a population that ends up being really restricted and small. Understanding the genetics of that population, I think, would be key to really determine its fate. And having, we know that there's not really a great library to compare barcoded specimens that people take for water quality monitoring. A lot of things are just listed as MOTUs, or molecular operational taxonomic units, AKA, if I gave that to my Nana, she could not go out and identify it. The MOTU means nothing, right? Unless you can identify, you know, associate it with the species. So I guess my hot take would be that I would hope that that those of us who do genetic and genomics work would continue to try and create these databases of genetic information so that it can be a resource to communities studying this.